He was born to a mother who was 18 years old. His father left when he was 2 years old, not old enough to remember his face, not old enough to understand why, not old enough to do anything except grow up in the particular silence that a missing father leaves behind, a silence that does not announce itself, that does not explain itself, that simply exists in the space where something essential was supposed to be and is not. He grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia, raised by grandparents, shuffled between worlds, belonging fully to none of them, too black for some rooms, too white for others, too foreign to fit, too American to belong elsewhere. His name was strange. His story was strange. His face did not look like the faces on the walls of power. And on November 4th, 2008, Barack Hussein Obama was elected the 44th President of the United States of America, the first black president in the 232-year history of a nation, built partly on the labor of enslaved people who looked like him. But this is not a political story. This is a story about a boy who grew up with a hole in his chest where a father was supposed to be, and what he built to fill it, and what he discovered when he realized the hole could never be filled, only transformed. This is a story about identity, about belonging, about the search for yourself in a world that keeps telling you that you do not quite fit. And it is the most important story you will hear today. Stay with me. The year is 1971. A 10-year-old boy sits in a classroom in Honolulu, Hawaii. He is quiet. He is watchful. He has the specific alertness of a child who has learned early that the world requires careful navigation, that what you are on the outside and what you feel on the inside are not always things you can afford to share with the same people. His mother is white, from Kansas, a woman of extraordinary intellectual curiosity and moral courage who chose, in 1960, to marry a black man from Kenya, a choice that in much of America at that time was not just unconventional but illegal. His father, Barack Obama, Sr., was brilliant, magnetic, a man who had come from a small village in western Kenya to the University of Hawaii on a scholarship, burning with ambition and intelligence, and the particular hunger of someone who has seen a larger world and decided to claim it. They fell in love. They married. They had a son. And then Barack Obama Sr. left, not cruelly, not with malice aforethought, but with the particular damage that comes from a man who is more in love with his own potential than he is capable of being present for the people who need him. He went to Harvard. He went back to Kenya. He sent letters. He sent a basketball once, a basketball, to a son he would see only one more time in his entire life, for a month, when the boy was 10 years old, a visit that the boy would later describe in his memoir with a restraint so careful and so complete that the pain beneath it is almost unbearable to read. That 10-year-old boy did not know who he was. He knew the facts of himself. He knew his name. He knew that he was the son of two people from two different worlds who were no longer together and whose worlds he was now required to navigate alone. But identity is not facts. Identity is the story you tell about yourself. The story that answers the question, who am I, really, when everything else is stripped away? And for Barack Obama, that question would take decades to answer, not because he was weak, not because he was broken, but because the question was genuinely, legitimately, profoundly hard. And the way he answered it, the long, difficult, honest, courageous way he answered it, is the reason that the story of his life carries a lesson that belongs to every person who has ever felt like they did not quite fit in the world that was given to them. You need to understand what it actually means to grow up without an identity that fits, not without food, not without shelter, not without opportunity. Obama had opportunities. He had education. He had a loving mother and dedicated grandparents, but without the thing that most of us take so completely for granted that we do not even know we have it until we see someone who does not. A clear answer to the question, where do I come from and what does that mean about who I am? In America in the 1970s, being biracial was not the culturally acknowledged, media-represented experience it has gradually imperfectly become. There was no language for what Obama was. There was no community that fully claimed him. There was no mirror that reflected his specific combination of backgrounds and said, "Yes, this is a recognized thing, you belong here." He was too dark for one world, too light for another. His name, Barack Hussein Obama, was a collection of sounds that no American school lunch table knew how to process. He later wrote about this period with an honesty that most public figures would never risk. He wrote about drinking and doing drugs in high school, not as tragedy, but as the specific numbing behavior of a young man trying to quiet a question that would not stop asking itself. Who am I? He went to Occidental College in Los Angeles, then transferred to Columbia University in New York. And at Columbia he did something that was either brave or desperate, or both. He threw himself into books, into ideas, into the intellectual project of understanding the world, because understanding the world felt more manageable than understanding himself. He graduated. He went to Chicago. He became a community organizer on the South Side, working with black communities that were being systematically neglected and underfunded, helping people register to vote, helping people navigate systems that were not built with them in mind. And here is where the struggle deepens in a way that most people who know Obama's story skip over. He was effective. He was respected. He was doing genuine good. And he was still lost, because the work was real, but the question had not been answered. Because you can be useful to other people and still not know who you are. Because service is not the same as identity, even when the service is beautiful and necessary. He decided to go to Kenya to find his father, or rather, to find the absence of his father. Since Barack Obama Sr. had died in a car accident in Nairobi in 1982, when Obama was 21 years old, he flew to Kenya. He met his grandmother. He met his half-siblings. He sat by his father's grave, and he wept. This man who would one day stand in front of the world with a composure so absolute, it seemed almost architectural. He sat in a Kenyan graveyard and wept for a father he had barely known, and for the question that the father's absence had planted in him and that he had been carrying, mostly alone, for his entire life. He wept not because he found the answer at that grave, but because he finally stopped pretending the question was not there. Here is what changed. It was not one moment. It was not a single revelation. Life does not usually work that way, and the lives of genuinely complex people work that way least of all. But there was a thread, a decision that wove itself through the Kenya trip and the grave, and the grandmother and the half-siblings, and the Columbia years, and the community organizing, and eventually the Harvard Law School years, where he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review. The decision to own the complexity, not to resolve it, not to choose a side of himself and pretend the other side did not exist, not to be black enough for one room or American enough for another or Kenyan enough for a third, but to stand in the middle of all of it, the Kansas grandmother and the Kenyan father and the Hawaiian childhood and the Indonesian years and the Chicago streets and the Harvard classrooms, and say, this is all of me, and all of me is enough. He went back to Chicago after Harvard. He could have gone to any law firm in the country. He went back to the South Side. He taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. He married Michelle Robinson, a woman from the South Side of Chicago, a woman of such grounded, clear-eyed, specific identity that she would later say that before Obama could love anyone else fully, he had to finish the work of knowing himself. She was right. He wrote a book called Dreams from My Father, not a political book, not a campaign book, a searingly honest memoir about the search for identity, about growing up between worlds, about the father who left, about the trip to Kenya, about what it means to build a self out of materials that do not naturally fit together. It was published in 1995. Almost no one read it, but the act of writing it was not for the readers. It was for him. It was the moment he sat down and told himself his own story, clearly, honestly, without flattery and without self-pity, and decided that the story was worth telling. That the boy without a father who did not know where he fit was not a story of lack. It was a story of construction. He had built himself, not been given himself, not inherited himself, not received himself from a father who stayed or a community that fully claimed him, but built himself, deliberately, painfully, over decades, out of everything he had been given and everything he had been denied. And that self, that specifically constructed, deeply examined, hard-won self, was about to become something the world was not ready for. And now we come to the part of this story that is about you. Because Barack Obama's journey from fatherless boy to president of the most powerful nation on earth is not just remarkable history. It is a map through the specific wilderness that every person faces who has ever been told by circumstance or by absence or by the world's indifference that they are not quite enough, not quite right, not quite the version of a person that the story of success was written for. The first lesson is this: your wound is not your weakness. It is the source of your specific power. Obama's fatherlessness was not incidental to his presidency. It was formative to it. The empathy he carried, the specific ability to sit with people who felt unseen, unheard, left behind by systems that were not designed for them, came directly from the experience of being a boy who felt unseen and unheard and left behind by the most personal system of all, his own family. He understood in his body and not just his mind what it meant to be told by the world that your story did not fit the template. And that understanding made him capable of a kind of political empathy that could not be faked and could not be taught. It had to be lived. Think about the wound you carry, the absence, the loss, the thing that was supposed to be there and was not. The way you grew up feeling like the world was not quite designed for someone who looked like you or came from where you came from or carried what you carry. That wound is real. The pain of it is real, but so is what it built in you. The sensitivity, the awareness, the capacity to see what others miss, because you were trained by your own suffering to notice what is not there. That is not your liability. That is your gift. He was sitting in a Kenyan graveyard crying. He was organizing communities that had no political value to offer him. He was writing a memoir that sold next to nothing. And every single one of those seemingly purposeless years was the exact preparation required for what came after. Because a man who does not know who he is cannot lead. Not really. Not at the level that history demands. He can manage. He can execute. He can perform leadership with enough skill that most people cannot tell the difference. But the leadership that moves history, the leadership that stands in front of a nation at its most frightened and most divided and says, yes, we can, with a conviction that enters people's chests like something physical, that leadership can only come from a person who has done the work, the internal work, the unglamorous, unwitnessed years-long work of becoming someone who knows exactly who they are and has made peace with every part of it. Do not be ashamed of where you are in that process. Do not apologize for the years you spent trying to figure out who you are, instead of building the thing the world wanted you to build. The figuring out is the building. It just does not look like it from the outside until suddenly it does. The third lesson, belonging is not found. It is built. Obama never found a community that fully claimed him without condition. He never arrived in a room where every part of him was already known and already welcome. He never had the experience that most of us take for granted, of looking around and seeing reflections of yourself everywhere you look. He built belonging. He built it in Chicago by choosing a community and committing to it fully. He built it in his marriage by being honest enough about his own incompleteness, that a woman of Michelle's clarity could choose to stay. He built it in the writing of his memoir by claiming every contradictory thread of his story as intentionally, defiantly his own. And he built it on the campaign trail in 2008 in a way that was almost miraculous to witness. He stood in front of audiences, black audiences and white audiences, and Latino audiences, and young audiences and old audiences, and he did not code switch into a different person for each room. He was the same person in every room, because he had done the work of becoming someone whose identity did not depend on the room's approval. The world will never give you a room where you fit perfectly. That room does not exist for most of us. The world is full of rooms that were designed for someone slightly different from you, someone with a different background, a different name, a different face, a different story. You have two choices. You can spend your life searching for the room that was built for you, or you can build the room yourself. Obama built the room, and then he invited the whole world in. The fourth lesson: the absence of a father is not the absence of a future. There are people watching this right now who grew up without a father. Not just Obama's story, your story. The empty seat at the school play. The question on the form that you did not know how to answer. The particular loneliness of having a wound that other people's families seemed not to have, and not knowing what to do with the difference. I want you to hear this as clearly as it has ever been said to you. What your father did not give you, the stability, the presence, the mirror, the model, the unconditional witness of a parent who stays, what he did not give you does not determine what you are capable of giving to the world, to your children, to the version of yourself that is still being built. Obama became the father he never had. He has spoken about this directly and honestly, about the determination formed in childhood to be present for his daughters in a way his father was not present for him, about the nights he was home for dinner, about the basketball games he coached, about the decision made consciously and kept fiercely, that the cycle would stop with him. The absence behind you does not have to be the absence ahead of you. You can be the one who changes what gets passed forward. You can be the end of one story and the beginning of another. I want to take you to one night. November 4th, 2008, Grant Park, Chicago. It is 11 o'clock at night and the television networks have just called the election. Barack Obama has received enough electoral votes to become the 44th President of the United States. 240,000 people are gathered in Grant Park. Not a rally crowd, not a campaign crowd, a gathering, a witnessing. People who had driven from across the country and flown from across the world because something in them understood that this night was not just a political event, it was a reckoning. There are elderly Black Americans in that crowd who were born before they had the legal right to vote, who remember the signs on the water fountains, who remember what it cost, in blood and in years and in lives, to even get to the starting line of what this moment represented. There are young people in that crowd for whom this is the first presidential election of their adult lives, who will carry this night inside them as a reference point, a proof of possibility and for the rest of their lives. There are white Americans in that crowd who are weeping in a way they did not expect to weep, feeling something break open in them about what their country had been and what it was attempting, imperfectly and incompletely, to become. And Barack Obama walks out onto that stage. He is 47 years old, the boy without a father, the child between worlds, the young man who drank to quiet the question he could not answer, the community organizer nobody had heard of, the memoir writer whose book sold nothing, the law professor, the state senator, the man who sat by his father's grave in Kenya and wept. He walks out onto that stage and the crowd makes a sound that is not quite a cheer. It is older than a cheer. It is the sound of people who had been told their entire lives that this was not possible, watching the impossible become a fact. And he opens his mouth, and he speaks. He says, if there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer. Tonight is your answer. Not I did this, not look at me. Tonight is your answer. The answer to the doubt. The answer to the wondering. The answer to the questioning. The answer given not by a speech but by a life, a specific, improbable, hard-won, searching, honest, constructed life that arrived at this moment not despite everything it had been through but because of it. Because here is the truth at the center of Barack Obama's story. The boy without a father did not succeed in spite of his wound. The wound taught him what absence felt like. And knowing what absence felt like made him fight, not for power, not for status, not for the approval of the rooms that had not been built for him, but for presence, for the presence of government in the lives of people who had been abandoned by it, for the presence of hope in the hearts of people who had been told their stories did not count, for the presence of a man in his daughters' lives who would not do what his father did. He became in the most literal possible way the opposite of what was done to him. Not through forgetting, not through the toxic positivity of pretending the wound was not real, but through the deliberate, disciplined, decades-long work of understanding the wound so completely that he could transform it, from the thing that happened to him into the thing that drove him, from absence into presence, from a hole in the chest into a capacity for connection so deep that two 140,000 people stood in a Chicago park and wept. That is what a wound fully faced can become. That is what you are capable of. So what do you do now? You do not close this video and simply feel inspired by Barack Obama's story and then go back to treating your own story as something less than worthy of the same level of attention and honesty, because here is what I know. You are carrying something. Maybe it is the father who left. Maybe it is the mother who was not present in the way you needed. Maybe it is the community that did not claim you, the room that was not built for you, the version of success that was held up as the standard and looked nothing like you. Maybe it is the years you spent not knowing who you were, the experiments and the numbing and the searching and the wrong turns, the years you have been taught to call wasted. They were not wasted. They were the Kenya trip. They were the graveyard. They were the memoir that no one read, but that you needed to write. They were the years of becoming someone who knows who they are. And that work, that specific, private, unwitnessed work of building an identity that does not depend on anyone else's approval or anyone else's presence, and that work is never wasted. Obama did not become president because he had everything. He became president because he had almost nothing of what the world said you needed. No father, no clear community, no template, no map, and he built it anyway. He built the identity. He built the belonging. He built the presence. He built the room, and then he stood in it without apology. That is your challenge today. Not to become president, not to stand in Grant Park in front of 240,000 people, but to do the work that Obama did in the years before anyone was watching. To sit honestly with the question of who you are, to stop running from the wound and start learning what it is trying to teach you, to build belonging instead of waiting to find it, to become the presence in your family, in your community, in your own life that you were never given, to look at the absence behind you and decide, clearly, fiercely, with every ounce of what you are made of, that it ends with you. The boy without a father became president of the world, not because the world was fair to him, not because he was given what he deserved, but because he refused in the graveyard, in the classrooms, in the organizing meetings, in the writing, in the marriage, in the fathering, in the campaigning, in every room that was not built for him. He refused to let the absence define the future. You carry that same refusal inside you. I know you do, because you are still here. You are still watching. You are still asking the question. And the fact that you are still asking means the answer is still coming. Trust the search. Do the work. Build the room. And when you walk out onto your stage, and whatever stage, however small, however large, in whatever city, in front of however many or however few, walk out as the full, constructed, hard-won, wound-and-all version of yourself. Because that version, the one that was built from everything you were given and everything you were denied, is the only version that can do what you were put here to do. The boy without a father became president of the world, and it is waiting to become yours. Yes, you can. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who is still searching. Someone who needs to know that the search itself is sacred, that the wound is not the end, that what was absent can become the source of everything. It always could. It always will.